Welcome, welcome everybody to Sauna Kunsthalle Zürich. Thanks for coming here, and please take off your coats if you want. There's also water if you need water. The reason why we do it up here is because we expected more than 20 people. We didn't expect that many people though, but we're very happy that you all came. So the reason why it is so hot up here, it has to do with the renovation of the walls and the building, so the air doesn't circulate as it does usually. Nevertheless, we're very happy to have you here, and especially to have you here, Phyllida. Thanks for coming back to that wonderful show you did here. Just to inform you about how long it's going to take, the whole thing, so that after 3 hours you maybe want to leave. No, it's 20. Phyllida is going to talk about 20 minutes how she put together the show, what her thoughts were. Then we open it to the questions, the public, and if there is time, we go back to one more short discussion we wanted to have. So I would say a warm welcome to Phyllida, and thanks for coming.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Put the microphone.
Oh yeah, I hate these things, but it's a thrill to see you all sitting on the stage. I just hope it doesn't collapse. But anyway, we can make that part of the work. But thank you all very much, and it's been an absolute thrill to work in this incredible museum with this incredible curator. And I'm really grateful for this fantastic opportunity to be in Zurich. So thank you all as well. I thought I would begin the talk whilst images of earlier work are showing about how I came to think about this exhibition and what my relationship is with this thing called an idea, which I think as artists we hold in high esteem, but which I find enormously problematic, because I never know whether the idea actually survives, and there's something about that which makes me enjoy the kind of lack of logic that I might start with something called an idea, but very rapidly it breaks down, and very rapidly I realize that I leave an audience with often quite a bewildering array of objects that can seem somewhat illogical and haphazard in the choice of what they are. But the idea for this exhibition was very exciting because Daniel offered the opportunity to use this upstairs space with the proviso that it was going to be renovated, it was going to be torn down, it was going to be rebuilt, and there was some problem with the building on that front. That immediately appealed to me because my process of making is very much about building and damage and deconstructing the object as much as remaking the object. So there seemed to be a sort of fragile relationship there that was actually to do with that process. So it seemed as though there was a way in which I could use this upstairs building as a reference for the way I make work, which is to begin to make something and to try and find out what the object is that I'm trying to make. And then it goes through these changes of often being destroyed and then remade. And so finishing work can actually be quite problematic. That's in quite severe contrast to works that actually have a very clear image, a lot of which are downstairs, where I'm sort of confident about what the work is going to be. but maybe not particularly confident about the method of making it. And I think some of these issues relate to a conversation that perhaps we can have at the end about the trinity of issues that I think most artists deal with, which are form, content, and subject, and the order in which we might play with those three issues, whether an artist is more inclined to put subject first, then the content, i.e. what the materials are and what goes into the work, and then the form, which for me is how the work actually takes on its existence. And for me, I think my work is very much led by form, and I'm constantly trying to hunt down what the subject might be. But in this case, why are you laughing? In this case, the subject was very much given with the building being broken down. So that was the start. That then led to downstairs being, in my mind, and this is where I find the whole idea of the idea, a folly, a kind of trap that myself as an artist, I know there are a lot of artists who are very confident about what the idea is and they can process it very methodically. I can't. But in this case, the idea was that the work downstairs would be an indication of things that change, things that have an inherent fragility and instability about them, that are shadowing another possibility for those objects. So the condition I made for all the objects that were made downstairs was that they would all be half made, half finished, which in a way accounts for their temporary aesthetic. The aesthetic is very raw and open. There are no mysteries as to what the materials are, or in a way how they're finished. But that idea of them being a kind of shadow of something that might have something more permanent elsewhere, that their other identity could be a more permanent version of themselves, is an idea that belongs to me, and I have no real faith in the fact that that idea would ever convey itself to an audience. So to me, the kind of destruction of the idea, the getting rid of the idea is incredibly important, and allowing the work to take form almost independently of having an idea. And so that's very much how these works downstairs all began to evolve. They're a kind of huge mixture of things that are quite familiar when you look at them, and then thrown into that, I think there are shapes that have just grown out of a process where I was trying to find out what that shape might become. And then there are actual cast forms where the process of making them allowed the shape to make itself. And that was a sort of very exciting thing to be involved in technically. And then there are other things that seem to almost have no logic whatsoever, like the profiles of the pianos. And I was trying to explain at supper just now what they are, and I think those shapes have probably are almost like symbolic forms that are in a way trying to identify something that where we do this thing of when we see an image, we immediately say, oh, that's a piano, or whatever it is, that's a chair. But when is it not a piano? And in this case, they're not pianos, even though they have that image of a piano. And I think for me, as a sculptor, I very much like that play on the fakery of sculpture, where things are pretending to be things, where there's a huge amount of play acting, things acting out, being objects that I have actually observed in the world or have a great fascination for, but actually know perfectly well that they're not those objects, and how the act of making removes things more and more and more from their source of inspiration. So again, for me, that references this kind of slow collapse of the idea and what I hope is something else taking place. Again, the idea of putting these objects very high up on these stilted structures was, in my mind, reaching up to this space here. So there was this sort of sense that these objects and the work was knocking on the ceiling of something that was above. Now, how on earth an audience is meant to know that, I've no idea, but perhaps that's also where I think, for myself, it's incredibly important that I don't get stuck with trying to prove the logic of something, but maybe allow this other event, which is almost like a theatrical event, take place, so that the work, what it is, just takes over from the original thought process, even though that original thought process was very important. I'm very curious now, having come back to it, to know what the audience thinks of the show, what the problems are. Does anyone here really hate it? I'd like to hear from them. Because sometimes it's incredibly, I don't know, a critic once wrote about my work that it was disgusting and was like, I don't know, it was the most incredibly vivid piece of writing. In fact, it was a brilliant piece of writing, even though it was condemning the work to eternal hell, you know. But it was, and what in his hatred of the work, he actually spoke a lot of truths about it. That the vivid description of why he disliked it was exactly what I wanted it to be, you know. So I think often a passionate response at both ends of the spectrum it's very stimulating, you know. But the point of this introduction was to really describe how the original joy of coming here and being able to work with two spaces, one on top of the other, triggered a whole load of ideas, a whole load of words like shadow play, dislocation, fracture, breakage, damage, you know, a lot of quite strong words that also, in my mind, played around with the notion of sculpture as a whole succession, for me, of phantom states, of a phantom being almost like a ghost-like evidence of my experience in the world, that I can never actually make the reality of the experience, but I can play around with things that can be substitutes for that. And that in this case, it was very much about the fact that a space was being broken down, and how that was a kind of, and is a kind of metaphor for so much that we know that is going on in the world around, but maybe also in our own lives. I don't mean that in a tragic sense, but things don't go to plan. And I think I find breakage and damage actually very beautiful. I don't find it a hideous thing that's got to be shoved away. I mean, obviously, in the vast humanitarian crises that are happening in the world, it is hideous and it is shocking. But I think in our everyday lives, the trivial incidents that happen that don't run to plan, I find fascinating, and I find them in comparison to perfectionism, which I find deeply disturbing and troubling, I find them much more interesting, why the break in something causes so much disturbance, and perfectionism is the thing that's revered and considered the thing to achieve. So I was immediately very much in the thrall of working in a building, especially a gallery building, which on the whole are meant to have their own forms of perfectionism, perfection about them. But this one was going through this state of change. And for me, that was an incredibly exciting challenge that reciprocated my ways of working, that the ways I tend to use and make work.
So maybe there are questions already here. Somebody would like to throw in a critique or
yes.
Positive or negative, or an opinion, or a simple question to Phyllida. Please, if you wish to do so, ask now. There will be other occasions, but it shouldn't be just a monologue or dialogue of the two of us. Well, okay, you and then you. I give you the mic.
Yes, thank you. A very simple question. You spoke about the term object, and then you said you're a sculptor. Tell me, what is the difference for you between the term object, and why do you choose it for this kind of work and not a sculpture?
As I was saying it, I was thinking, oh, so brilliant, yes, brilliant question you found out. No, I tend not to use the word object, and I have no idea why that came out of my mouth. I think it's also actually self-consciousness that sculpture during maybe since the 1960s, the word sculpture and what it represents has had a lot of trouble. It's caused a lot of problems. Maybe because there's a history, a modernist history, that was very, very serious about what was good and what was bad sculpture, what was right and what was wrong sculpture. And I was very much taught with that approach. That's good and that's bad. And I hated it. It made me incredibly rebellious. And then during the 60s, as sculpture sort of expanded into so much else, the word sculpture almost stopped being used, and people talked about making, or they talked about object making. To me, an object, when I just simplify it, is much more an image, whereas sculpture is an evolving thing where there isn't any one image to it. You have to walk round it, and you can never quite hold what the image of it is, because it changes at every point. That's what, I think what I'm really interested in is sculptural language, rather than saying this is sculpture and that isn't sculpture. I think the weather can be sculpture, or a smell can be sculpture. I'm sure we all know this in this room, that a sculpture isn't just a material object thing. But when I think of objects, I think of an image. This is my personal, other people might have different ways of defining it, but thank you for pointing that out, because I when I heard myself say that, I won't say what the swear word was. I thought, oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Good evening.
Yeah,
if
hi.
I listen to your words and I see your work, so I have the image in my mind that I would say, is it a memento mori that you are showing us? It's like, it's not an old picture, but you have these sculptures, you have these things that are destroyed. We don't know how they came herein, and so if I listen to you, it has to be to remind us what happened to our time. Do you look the same?
I don't think I see it as a memorial to things, but I think as an attachment to your question, I think what really interests me about looking at art is the syntax of how we look at art. Is what we're looking at in the present tense, or is it in the past tense, or is it even in the future tense? And so, to me, this show is very much about the present tense, actually. It's about it's happening now. The objects have been placed up there now, which means if it has the atmosphere about being in the past or being about the memories, I think that's a slightly different issue for me. I can't answer that. Maybe it has an atmosphere of memento mori, but for me, the actual action of it, of placing these things up there, and the decisions were very, very quick. It's very much about the present tense, whereas I think other works I've done have a sense of maybe being in the past tense. Maybe these two objects on the wall, wrong word, these two sculptures. I think I am neurotic about using the word sculpture because people have been so infuriated by it, and it's, for all sorts of reasons. Yeah, but anyway, if that's the best I can do to answer your very interesting question. I hadn't thought of them as memento mori. I thought of them more as being almost like evidence of now, especially with the ever-changing scene in the room behind you. Sorry, what?
There's a third question.
Yeah, hi. I'm up here.
Oh, hi. Hi there. Hi.
I don't know if the question really makes sense, but I was wondering if we could think about narrative, the term narrative, a little bit together, maybe, because of course it's an all-encompassing spatial work, and the idea of narrative in the classical sense that maybe even involves by walking around the sculpture might now not work anymore, or. What is the narrative? Where is the event actually taking place? Are there many events? Just how do space and narrative and the idea of sculpture maybe a break with the classical idea of sculpture? Where do these things come together?
To me, it is a spatial narrative. It's whether the space is controlling the work or the work is controlling the space. And for me, this is always an exciting challenge to take on. So the idea of making the work go through the three galleries was the narrative, and also repeating shapes, so that maybe this idea of sculpture being something that you can never quite get hold of, or that's my relationship. Even if I make things out of cement and they're incredibly heavy, I still think there's a huge ephemerality there because of the process of walking round, or the way in which the space at that moment invites you to walk around as much as the objects do. So that's one narrative. The other narrative is when I'm in the studio making these things with, say, 3 or 4 assistants, I'm only thinking about the process of making the sculpture, the process of its possibility, of where it's going to go. The minute it all arrives, it's like being told, I'm Hamlet, and I've got to go on now and be Hamlet, and I haven't even read the play. It's almost a moment of absolute terror, because the difference between making the work in the studio and then bringing the studio to the space, then the performance has got to be almost invented on the spot. So there isn't a literal narrative, but I hope there's a spatial and formal narrative that is actually quite spontaneously made up in the week that I have to install the work. About the audience. The audience at that moment becomes crucial. Yeah, they are the protagonists. You know, it's as if there are three performers. There's the space, the sculptures, and the audience. And my ideal is that the three are working together. That's what I want, but whether that, again, it's that kind of grandiose artist's idea. You never know whether it actually happens or not, but that's the intention. But the idea of a narrative being almost an empty space intrigues me. I find that fascinating. Yeah. Mm.
I just wanted to add something to this. I think one of the reasons, beside the forms and the challenges and the size of the sculptures, I always thought your work is a bit nastier than you present it or than we think it is. So there's a lot of manipulation going on, not in a bad or nasty or negative way, but I think we're very much guided through space by these sculptures, and then it actually gives these sculptures a lot of power that they don't show, because they look like, oh, I happen to come here and just I stand here now for a moment and I'm going away. But I actually think we're the way we walk, you see people walking in here and then they go on this stage and they look through the halls and then they go back. They're like actors in a play. It's just we don't realize it, and it's only maybe afterwards when you go home, all of a sudden you think, oh, wait a second, that thing told me something to do. Is a perfect choreography. I just didn't realize it. It's just the way we're sitting here now. But so I think that was something I was very much impressed by, the way they pretend to be something which they actually are, but they're also a lot of other things. And these other things, they linger on. At least that's what happened with me. They linger on even weeks or months after the show, because it kind of comes back into my mind on very strange moments. So, Leila, you wanted to ask something, and then somebody there as well.
Is it? Okay. I wanted to actually ask you about the structures downstairs. It was interesting to hear you say that they're knocking on the ceiling, but they have, for me, this vertiginous quality that's like flying buttresses. That's like one of those Gothic. And I just wondered if you could say something about the ecstasy of height.
Well, I think I've become, over the years, and have been for many years, interested in how we look at sculpture, and how sculpture and a lot of art occupies the same space that we occupy. So there's a very, what I would call, comfortable relationship between how we encounter artwork. And then it fascinates me that, especially with something like sculpture, it doesn't take on all the space, that we're not physically prompted to look up or round or underneath these things, which sculpture is the whole object. It doesn't in a way have a top, bottom or sides, it's a whole thing. And therefore that made me very curious, probably about 30 years ago, to try and install works so that there would be a surprising view of what the object was, that I think in a way reflects something of how we look at nature, how we look at the urban environment, that we're often looking up or through or beyond just the immediate head height kind of experience, and that this could be reflected in how we can enter an exhibition. And again, it's about who's controlling what. Is the space controlling us and the way we look at art, or is the art controlling the space and us? So it's that symbiotic relationship. But vertiginousness fascinates me. And also, there's that same thing of, you know, when you're standing on the mountain, I suddenly feel very nervous about saying that word in Switzerland. When you're standing on the mountain, you can't actually see the mountain. And I also feel that there's something quite sculptural about how does the object disappear and how does it reappear? You know, that when you're at a distance from things, you can see them, but when you're actually absolutely close up, you can't. So I think that has a lot to do with this placing things high up. And vertiginousness intrigues me as a physical experience, because I can't stand on a chair without. So it's very much about a kind of envy to be able to do physical things that I'm not capable of doing.
And I mean, there is also downstairs when you go, when you come in and you see the force-structure, and then when you go, you lose all the control. So it is a bit of a vertigo as an experience of height, but of control of space. And the same here. You never actually, your brain tries when you look through the holes, your brain tries to make a unit out of what you see. And you never succeed.
Yes, exactly.
So that is also, it can create a vertigo moment, or a moment also of unsatisfaction, which I think is interesting, because what we expect from art is being satisfied, or from films or from books. And then when we're not satisfied, we basically think it's a bad book or a bad film, but maybe it's actually a really interesting film because it doesn't give you what you expect. And that's what's happening here and downstairs.
But I think the glimpse, which is a word I love, you know, where you can just catch something for a moment and what you retain from that.
Yeah.
I find that fascinating. I think I make work that can be seen very quickly. We just went downstairs to see the Rodney Graham show. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's absolutely, the light boxes are just absolutely fantastic, I think. And you can't take your eyes off them. You just are riveted by them. I think my work is the absolute opposite. It isn't riveting. And you can walk through it extremely quickly. And maybe there are things that then linger from having walked through it quickly. And I'm sort of fine with that. You know, it's a different way of presenting art or making art or getting involved in art. And certainly when I did the Tate show, which was down the Devine Gallery, is a long, I don't know if any of you have been to it, but a long 80-meter hall, and it's a passageway so that everybody walks through it. And I purposefully used that as a way in which the work would be walked past. It would be work made to be walked past, rather than to be, as in the Rodney Graham case, where you really want to stop and you just want to study these intriguing images and every detail of them.
Yes, I have a question about your way of creation. You mentioned that you always want to leave the sculptures unfinished, or that it's an interest of yours to not finish them completely.
In this show,
yeah, yes. How do you know when to stop? What's your your approach to finishing or unfinishing them?
This show that was in Munich, I had no idea how to finish this pink stage. And when we were there installing, we had to just keep on making more and more of these pink slabs to go on, because I kept on saying, no, I want the crust thicker and thicker. And so, yes, I have a problem with finishing work quite often. Or I want more of something, more and more and more. I don't think I'm a minimalist, I'm a maximalist. And so that more and more thing is quite, it's almost hysterical, you know, so there has to be a point where either weight or technical things or time becomes the control. And sometimes I have works where I can go on and on and on, and there are a few in the studio at the moment. So I can't really answer the question coherently, but all I know is that these works downstairs are not finished in the sense that I would want to put another surface on them or add more to them in some way or start cutting them up, etc., etc. They were kind of arrested at a very particular point, if that answers your question.
Do you always need rooms to put your sculptures inside? Because when I look at this picture,
yes,
the room almost bursts.
Yes.
And I could imagine a work like this outside.
Yes, yes.
Never ending, being a part of the nature.
No, there are two works for the Venice Biennale that are outside. And I have done works outside. And it's what I find incredible is that lack of no wall space. You know, there are no walls. So there's a completely different relationship with scale and with what the actual sight line of the work is, because those controls that a gallery put on are both incredible. You know, they can be used, but they can also be an irritation in a way. And so not having that, other things then have to be taken into consideration in terms of people and the place. So yes, I've got a couple of commissions coming up which are about being outside. So I'm excited about it, not because of the commission thing, but just being able to use that amount of oxygen or air around the work and seeing how that, what that does to the edges of the work, if you know what I mean. You know, the edges, as you've described so well, suddenly have the potential to be quite fluid in a way. Yeah. No, thank you for the question.
So is it a commission for Venice, but also another one?
And another two, yes, coming up.
Are they going to be?
I can't. Can I pass on that question just at the moment? Sorry, no, I'm not lying. They do exist. I don't think I think all these things you have to learn as an artist. So where you're not allowed to say this, that, and the other.
Another question that can't be answered.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
I'm quite curious what happens with all the stuff in the dismantling. I mean, your studio must be fascinating and crazy, but do you meticulously take everything apart, label?
Oh, God.
No.
Well,
okay, tell me what you do.
No, hang on. This one, I mean, this isn't. This then went to Basel Unlimited. And weirdly, it sold. Well, when we were installing it, it was the last thing we thought of. And I think Daniel knows the team I work with, you know, and they're quite. I think they find that whole commercial side of art they take, well, we say in English, they take the piss out of it the whole time. So, I mean, they didn't expect this work to be sold, and it wasn't made with that in mind. So when we did it again at Basel Unlimited, it was a surprise that it was sold, because it then had to go back to storage. We then had to all go out and go over every inch of it to make sure that it was going to be behave well when it went to its new owner. But to answer your question, a lot of the works get destroyed, and a lot of materials get salvaged and come back to the studio to be reused. A lot of the works downstairs a lot of the materials were at Tate and were in other sculptures as well. And then a lot of works, well, not a lot of works, some works get sold as well. So there's a sort of, there's a kind of variety of destinations for the works. But yes, the studio is full of materials that can be used again, yeah.
So just to add something to your question, actually when I was working in Pittsburgh, they bought Upside Down House, it's called, and one of the problems was that they hesitated to buy it because they said we can only build it once, and then when we take it down again, it's, you know, with the drills and everything, the holes, we can't install it a second time. So we're going to have an artwork that we paid for, but we can't show it. So the team had to come up with a new structure for the work, so it could be installed repeatedly. And I think it's, and what you said about finishing the work, I mean, there's one other element that I could observe, it's the team. Sometimes the team says no, and then you can't move home, right?
Yes,
they do sometimes, and so I forgot what I wanted to add something to that. Anyway, maybe I will come back. Somebody else has a question. Optal?
Just a quick question about another body of work you do about the drawings.
Oh yeah.
No, we're not seeing any here at the moment, but I mean, there are those wonderful books that were published. And you've been always drawing, no? All since you started becoming an artist.
Yeah.
It's like a major part of your work. We're also just talking about the sculpture now, but maybe you could say a few words about drawings too.
Well, drawing is just continuous activity I do in sketchbooks and quite formal drawings, you know, big coloured drawings, I call them, and I've always done it, so it doesn't. Yes. A lot of drawings can be these thoughts about something that could be made, but in quite an ambivalent way. Others are very clear images. Like there's a whole set of drawings for the show here that are very clear as to what they are. And then there can be drawings that are done after the show that are about a kind of evolved form of those works as well. So it covers a lot of different ways of, I think, making the work. I think they've always got making the work in mind, but sometimes the drawings are actually very abstract and very unclear as what the sculptural form is that's being drawn. So we were just in the Henry Moore show just now, and I was telling Daniel that when I was, 18, I'd been at Chelsea Art School, which is an art school in London, and when I came to the end of that, after 3 years, I decided to go for a scholarship to go to Rome. And I went into the room with my portfolio of drawings, and it was sort of 10 very angry-looking men sitting at a table, and I put the drawings out, and the chairman of this group turned to one of the people on the panel and said, "Mr. Moore, would you like to take Miss Barlow and talk to her about your drawings?" And Henry Moore stood up and took me by the arm and took me over to the table and said, "You know, my dear, you're a very bad drawer." Which has sort of stuck with me all my life, you know, and actually given me incredible freedom. I just think, well, I'm a really bad drawer, so what the hell, you know? Just, yeah.
You didn't go to Rome?
No, no. They said again, "My dear, you're far too young and you are a lady. You can't go to Rome on your own." Those were the days.
I remembered my question actually. So how many works survived before like 2000? You might,
I've got.
How many are around that one could see?
None actually. I've got one that. Yeah.
One from 65 to 2000.
I know. Yeah.
That's not a lot.
No. No. Yeah.
And then it's the ones that were kept. It started like 2003, 4, 5, or was that?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
What intrigues me a little bit is kind of if you deal with sculptures, and I feel this very strongly when I look at your work, this present moment, the now, and the material in a space. But on the other hand, you kind of work against that. You're escaping it in a way, because it gets like you dismantle it, it's not existing anymore, there is kind of a contradiction in this approach.
Because I think sculpture is contradictory. And I think very early on, after this quite severe training I had, which actually now I'm incredibly grateful for, because it gave me incredible independence, learning these sculpture techniques, casting, welding, woodwork. They were great resources to start my own studio. But I think the idea of sculpture having to have this longevity about it, when the experience of it is actually quite ephemeral, that walking around it, where the object constantly disappears, is something that, for me, was the main fascination. And when I sort of early on started experimenting with paper and those kind of materials, which lots of people were doing in the 60s and 70s. No, it was nothing unique about that. But then placing these things outside and just seeing them naturally disintegrate, I think it gave me a different relationship with sculpture. That it didn't have to be something that lasted forever. But as well as doing the drawings, I make a lot of very small works. The whole time. Some of them are models for the shows I'm going to do, and some of them are just my own work, just very, very spontaneous objects, sculptures that are just for the sheer pleasure of doing it. I think one of the things of being the age I am is that it's become important to do exactly what I want to do. And that critical voice that I think a lot of artists can live with for years, where there's a sort of devil on your shoulder telling you not to do things. I've just got rid of that. And I think I would really recommend that to all artists, do exactly what you want to do, because I think the Western system of art schools is fantastic, but I don't think it's a liberal education, actually. I know that's what it's meant to be, but I think it's a strangely illiberal education where the critical mechanism that evolves in art schools and teaching is fantastic, and we all need to take that on. But I think it has I think it can last too long in life, you know, and there has to be a point where you take the risks and just say, now it's up to me, and I'm, for better or for worse, I'm just going to do it. And so these small works are very much, because they can be done quickly, and I like working quickly, I often have a result at the end of the day. And the next day I can begin again if that's not quite what I wanted the day before, but it's completely on my own terms. Yeah. I don't know if that's answered your question.
So I would say one more question.
Maybe two more?
Okay, two more questions.
I don't want to take the last question, but I was fortunate enough to be part of that process of installing the work here and got to know part of your team. And I was wondering if you could speak about how that changed, how that changed having assistants, and also like the limits to assistants, if you like have had too many assistants and decided to like decrease your team again, and just maybe how your role has changed in that as well.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. Yes, I've actually used assistants since the late 80s, actually, so I've used them a lot. One of my first assistants, and she often jokes about it, was Rachel Whiteread. And that was a real sort of, you know, where I, as the artist, then employs the genius who kind of rises to. And she is a great friend, so she often jokes about that time of being my so-called assistant. But I think, yes, you're right. I mean, my role with the assistants is to work incredibly closely with them so that I'm actually working on the work at the same time as they are. So it's not as though it's delegated and it just happens. So that's what makes the studio quite a tumultuous place, because often we have to begin again, and therefore it requires enormous patience on their part, and I'm very lucky to have that team. But you're right about when we've had two shows on the go, like there was a time with this show and beginning the Venice works where there were two teams, and that is quite challenging, not so much for me but for them, because there's a lot of information that's happening, a lot of things not going quite right, things having to be begun again, you know, and that is testing, yeah. But I think it requires quite an intimate relationship with assistants. It's not just go over there and do that, you know, it's actually, can we try this out today, but it may well not work, then can we begin again? You know, it requires a relationship, you know. Does that, yeah.
So, okay, one important question.
How do you work as a teacher?
How do I work?
As a teacher.
I taught full-time for the last, I think, 20 years of my teaching career, so that was 4 days a week. And then the other 3 days were in the studio. Does that answer the question?
What do you transmit to the students?
Oh, I think because of my experience at art school, I think I felt I couldn't be a didactic teacher. I couldn't say, this is good and that is bad. And this is, I hope as a teacher I was able to try and understand what the intention of the work was, what was in a student's mind. That's what fascinates. I think also the sort of psychology of how you become brave as an artist interested me a lot, how you would really have the most courageous ideas, and then what would be the most expedient, practical way of going about those. You know, not just wanting to make something out of a material that costs thousands of pounds, but actually how you adapt your thoughts and your imagination to something that's actually possible to do. But I loved the kind of questions that might emerge. That was really, I think, what my love for teaching was about. I think the good, bad, right, wrong thing just doesn't agree with me, you know, if that's...
Okay, one more, the last one. Lucky you.
I was wondering, is there a difference between the studio...
Oh, where are you? Oh, there, sorry.
Is there a difference between your studio practice if you're talking about doing the object in a very private environment, and it's about the making and the planning of big exhibitions? What's the difference for you to work?
Because I don't have to use any verbal language when I'm making these small or middle-sized works, and I think that's a huge difference. I mean, trying to give instructions is absolute torture. You know, when you're actually saying, okay, when you put the cement on, just use one swipe with your hand, and you're having to give those instructions, and I've realized they're a bit like giving instructions that may be like how you would clean a table, or how you would sweep the floor, or fix something. They're not art instructions, they're actually expedient instructions that are much more connected with other domestic or manual labor instructions. But when I'm working on my own things that don't involve assistance, I don't have to worry about any kind of explanation. So there's different kinds of freedom. There's the freedom of being able to use assistants who can get up very high and do all the things that I can't do physically. But then there are the setbacks of that, of having to constantly explain verbally. And then there's the other work, which has a freedom where there's no verbal language at all.
But do you show your small works?
Yes, they're in the basement at the moment. You can see some down there. The small works, yeah.
Yeah, you can ask at House at Worth to get you downstairs, and they have a small exhibition, like a showroom, and there are
two little works down there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good. You see, we could go on and on forever, and that's why I like to work with Phyllida, because it's always very, very interesting. But at a certain moment, she has to stop with her artwork, and we have to stop discussing. And so there's, I think, a bit of... Is there some wine downstairs, right? Yes, there is. So if you want, there is some drinks downstairs, there's water. Thanks everybody for coming, for asking all these interesting questions.
Yeah.
Thanks Phyllida for being here.